Welcome, everyone. Hi, thank you all so much for joining us. My name is Natalie Olivas. I am the community organizer with Regeneración Pájaro Valley Climate Action here in Watsonville, California. We will be starting with some language and accessibility instructions. This program is being interpreted live into Spanish and Mixteco. So I would like to invite one of our Mixteco interpreters, Sylvia, to come on and help give these instructions. So primero, en español, si estás escuchando este programa en la aplicación de Zoom, vas a buscar ese botón que se mira como un mundo y escoger su idioma. También hay la opción de apagar el audio original. Also, for our English speakers, make sure to take note of that interpretation button, as there will also be some interpretation from Spanish into English later on in our program. Sylvia? I'm not hearing from Sylvia. I don't know if you all are, so let's go ahead and move on to the next slide for now. Si estás escuchando este programa en su teléfono, se va a mirar un poquito diferente. Vas a buscar esos 3 puntos y ahí puedes escoger su idioma. And next slide. Y si estás viendo este programa en el Facebook Live, para oír la interpretación en español, vas a llamar a este número. Es un número gratis y cuando entras vas a poner ese código de acceso y vas a escuchar en su teléfono y puedes apagar el volumen de su computadora. So thank you so much to all of our interpreters, Magali Morales, Naira Adriana Pacheco Guzman, Angela Martinez Gracida, and Sylvia Garcia. We are so grateful to our interpreters for making this possible. In our oppressive society, languages are used to reinforce sexism, racism, and other oppressions to keep people from uniting and working together. We can all be more accepting of other languages and connect with more people as part of building a united movement to protect life on Earth. So please be patient with us as we remind our speakers to speak slowly and take pauses. Every 30 minutes or so, we will be taking a 1-minute language break to give you all a rest from listening and our interpreters a chance to switch roles. Next slide. We will also have the closed captioning feature. Thank you very much to our live captioner. So you have the option to view subtitles, and through this feature, there will also be the option at the end of the webinar to download the full transcript. Next slide. We have the option in the chat to send chat to either all the panelists, which is all of our behind the scenes tech team, or you can select that drop down and select all panelists and attendees so that you can share your message with everyone. How to ask a question, you can use the Q&A box to ask questions to our tech team regarding the webinar. We won't be taking questions from speakers until our panelist section, but you guys can be using that during the webinar. So our mission at Regeneración is to work with community partners to inspire everyone to respond locally to the global challenge of a changing climate. And as you'll see, we have an amazing lineup of community partners. We have Pájaro Valley Arts, who provided the slideshow you all saw at the beginning. And if you missed it, you can view the entire gallery again on the Pájaro Valley Arts website. We have the Watsonville Wetlands Watch and their Climate Corps Leadership Institute, California Environmental Protection Agency, the Community Foundation for Monterey County, who supports our partnership with Cal State University, Monterey Bay. We have a few more. Ecology Action and Central Coast Community Energy, as well as the rest of our wonderful nonprofit partners. So onto our agenda. We have an amazing agenda lined up today for this Climate of Hope Forum. We are thrilled to have speakers who will be reimagining how we can build a just and sustainable world that works for everyone. But first, in order to gather some sense of community, I would like to ask and share with the audience who is here today with our first poll. So I know many of us fill multiple roles, so feel free to choose which one fits you best in this hour. Leave that open. I thought I'd be able to see who's filling it out, but I can't. So I'm just gonna wait a couple seconds, give you all a chance. There we go. All right, so we have a lot of students, which is really exciting. I went to Cal State University, Monterey Bay, so I hope a lot of my peers and fellow alumni are also here. It's so fantastic to see this audience come together from all these different sectors. At Regeneración, we always stress that climate and justice are universal issues that can't be separated by profession or business. And I'm so glad that you all chose to join us today and integrate this into your life and into your work. So our next poll is, where are you joining the event from? There we go. So I will say that these place names are settler colonial names. And in addition to sharing this information with us today, I encourage you to find out whose land you live on, the history of the indigenous people who have stewarded it for thousands of years, as well as their resurgence and revitalization work now. Find out how you can support indigenous people where you live today in their efforts to reclaim the rights to their land. So with that, let's close the poll and share those results. Sweet. Thank you all so much. We are so honored to have this diverse audience. As I mentioned, we are a very small organization out of Watsonville, California, so it's incredible to see this wide range of people joining us. So now I'd like to introduce our first speaker who will share how Indigenous knowledge and sovereignty is vital in deconstructing our current systems of oppression. Kenyon Sayers Roods is a Costanoan, Ohlone Mutsun, and Chumash public speaker and consultant. Kenyon also goes by her given native name, Coyote Woman. With a background in web design and interactive media, Kenyon has been using her knowledge of Indigenous insights and leadership to initiate and facilitate conversations that bridge the gap between Indigenous pedagogies and corporate and state entities. So welcome, Kenyon. Can I invite you onto this virtual stage?
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Mishmin Tuhis, Kanrakat Canyon, Coyote Woman, Sayers Roods. An introduction in my Mutsun Ohlone language. I currently am in Tamian Ohlone territory. Some of you may recognize this space as San Jose Valley. I traditionally come from Mutsun Ohlone territory. My home is Indian Canyon Nation, which happens to be the only federally recognized Indian country between Sonoma and Santa Barbara along central coastal California. I am daughter of tribal chairwoman Anne Marie Sayers, and I recognize my privilege being raised on the land of my ancestors, where my grandmothers have always been from. And being raised in a both traditional and intertribal environment where culture sharing and recognizing Indigenous protocol is a fundamental way of life. I truly believe that through culture sharing, we all can celebrate our elders, our ancestors, and recognize that all of us are Ama Piritakawas, which is people of this land. We are taking steps to acknowledge Indigenous protocol, to acknowledge the historical people of this land, and we in community are standing together as people of this land. My mother and my grandmother have always taught me that when song, ceremony, and dancing stops, so does the earth. I too believe that. And so I would like to offer a song to help ground myself and to offer a small bit of ceremony in this circle. This is a grandmother song to honor our grandmother, their grandmothers, and in all Mother Earth. For without them and without her, we would not be here. We share this time and this space together, and it's with that humility, that gratitude, that present-mindedness that I offer this song here to all of you. This is Canyon's grandmother song. I will use my regalia as an instrument today, my medicine, my necklace, because Indigenous peoples, we do not wear costumes. Moi moi kawa, moi moi ka, moi moi no, moi moi oko. Moi moi yo na yo konale. Moi moi yo konale. Moi moi yo kawana. Moi moi yo ko. Moi moi no. Moi moi yo ko. Moi moi yo na yo konale. Moi moi yo konale. Moi moi yo kawa. Moi moi yo moi moi ko. Moi moi song and breath, Holy Spirit. And oh, if you ever hear a Californian say, oh, it's how we end prayers and songs and ceremonies, welcoming energy and sending prayers off in a good way. So you might be in other circles say, oh, I thank you for your time and willingness to join this circle. As a California Indigenous two-spirit artist, I have spent my life in truth in history. So I find it very important that we voice the importance of honoring native land and recognizing Indigenous protocol. Because today we follow a common protocol, such as an example would be when we may want to borrow a cup of sugar and visit a neighbor. We don't walk right into their kitchen and take it. Most of us don't. It's very important that we seek a consensual engagement. Some of us will go up to the door, knock on the door, find out if our neighbor is home, find out if they're willing to interact with us, seek a consensual interaction, and then find out if it's possible to borrow that cup of sugar. Traditionally, my ancestors didn't have all of these buildings and fences and walls, but we still respected each other's territory. So I find it important today that we take these steps, that we acknowledge Indigenous protocol by becoming familiar with the Indigenous peoples, histories of these spaces, places in today's post-colonial settler environment. I truly believe that when honoring truth in history, that we can learn from Indigenous pedagogies so we may learn how to strategize sustainable futures, because it's very, very important that we not only recognize how our actions and words impact our community, our environment, but 7 generations in the future. And sometimes that means saying no to those quarter-end dividends. It sometimes means saying no to profitable turnaround. we need to consider how our actions and our words impact all sacred living systems. We as humans need to recognize that the animals and the plants, they are the first people of the earth. We are the first humans, but the first beings that were here. We as humans were given life to be good stewards, to take care of the earth, and to recognize how all of us are part of that ecological system. I will bring up topics like Western settler mindset, which happens to hold a definition to me. To me, Western settler colonial mindset is to be negligent of the sacred, to be engaged in a capitalistic, materialistic, disposable society that has blinders on, focused on the economy, focused on resource extraction of both natural resources and of Black and brown bodies. It's not accountable. It's not humble. And it is not reciprocal. That mindset denies that we need to be accountable to recognizing all of our relatives. These plants, these animals are all living beings. How are we being accountable to these sacred living systems? Are we caring about where our food comes from? What it took for it to get to us? Are we respecting the life that's lived for the gift that's given? I visit classrooms of 3rd and 4th graders. I get to talk about genocide to these young beings. But I use humor and I use empathy to talk to them about truth in history. Because if we avoid it, if we sweep it under the rug, we are not helping. I do believe that if you are in a position of making decisions that impact the environment, that impact the community, that impact any of these systems, if you do not know the history of the land that you are on, more than 50, 150, 250, 500 plus years, if you do not know the history of the land, the first name of the indigenous peoples, the indigenous pedagogies of which Native peoples tended the land, I don't think you're coming to the table fully informed. Because I do know that my ancestors used cultural burning as a method to encourage the ecological diversity on this land. It helps the oaks. Right now, we are suffering from sudden oak death. And millions of dollars of people with that colonial mindset, that Western settler colonial mindset of what that science is, are trying to find an antidote, a solution, something to possibly spray or solve for sudden oak death. Yet it's an ecological issue. We in community should be recognizing how humans are a part of that system. For many years, many of us try to divorce ourselves from that system. Yet when other people talk about living systems, I'll use hunter and predator. If there are coyotes and there are rabbits, if there are too many rabbits, the coyotes can't keep that in balance. So the rabbits will take over and their food source will become limited. Same thing happens when too many predators exist, not enough prey. Too many predators, and then they can't sustain their population. Us as humans are in that system. Yet how are we accounting for how our decisions and our actions play a role? So I truly believe that when we honor truth in history, when we all can figure out ways of decolonizing what we've been taught and re-indigenizing our approaches to making solutions, I find it to be a reasonable way to consider how all of us can be good ancestors in training, how all of us can honor truth in history. To me, it's all relative. I personally, when I was a youngster, I did not like the education system I was brought up in. I didn't appreciate learning about these settlers bragging and boasting how they colonized and took over. And it was a very one-sided narrative. I didn't see myself or my community or the diverse perspectives of how things came to be. So many of us have been brought up in an environment that we don't know what we don't know. We do need to be kind with each other, yet we still need to be assertive. When it comes to honoring truth in history, we all can take steps. Those of us who are voices of the community, those of us who are educators, those of us who are decision makers and organizers and agency representatives, all of us can be proactive to honoring truth in history. So I'm just another community member, a consultant, an Indigenous Two-Spirit voice. I'm ambiguous with my pronouns, she, they, coyote, and I'm here to share a little bit of my perspective. If we gathered in person at CSUMB, we would be gathering in Rumsian Ohlone territory. And I'm trying to remember how much time I have. I want to close my perspective to the best of my ability in offering a song in my language, and the word is about hummingbirds. If we were in Monterey, the first language of that land is Rumsian. And the way my Rumsian relatives say hummingbird is they say humaya. Humaya is the hummingbird. In my language, we say humunya. And so I want to offer a little hummingbird songs. So this is a little Mutsun hummingbird song. Humunya, 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 weha, weha. Humunya, 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 weha, weha, ho. Humunya, 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 weha, weha. Humunya, 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 weha, weha, ho. Humunya, 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 weha, weha. Humunya, 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 weha, weha, ho. Humunya, 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 weha, weha. Humunya, 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 weha, weha, ho. Oh, oh, oh. So I invite you to learn about the native peoples of the land that you are on, to learn about the history of these spaces and places in today's post-colonial settler environment, and consider ways that you can educate and offer insight to your audiences, to your community, to be more inclusive, and to recognize how we can offer this for justice, equity, diversity. It's really important that we honor truth in history. I'm just one Indigenous person, and I've learned so much from my relatives. I am greatly appreciative to allies, advocates, what is the other word? Accomplices, and co-conspirators of beautiful futures where we can be humble, and appreciative and accountable. So I find it really important that no matter what we do, we honor truth in history. So thank you for sharing and having my voice. I'm honored to share space with all of you. So
Thank you so much, Canyon, for sharing your song with us and your knowledge on re-indigenizing and honoring truth and history. I hope that we can all continue these conversations within our circles. Next, I'm going to introduce our student researcher, Monica Urias, but first we will be taking a 1-minute break and she will be coming back after that break. So thank you all.
Hello everyone, I'll be presenting my research project in a moment, but before I begin, we would like to know about your knowledge of how climate change is impacting girls and women. A poll should pop up any moment, and please rate your answer from 1, which is no knowledge, to 5, which is very detailed knowledge. I'll give you a few moments to complete that. Okay, cool. It looks like most of you have some knowledge on this, which is really good. Okay, so I'll begin by introducing myself. My name is Monica Urias, and my pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm currently in my second year at CSU Monterey Bay, and I'm majoring in environmental science, technology, and policy. I am a first-generation Mexican-American STEM major, and this is my first time working on a research project. Some things I like to do in my free time are spending time in the great outdoors and learning about the interactions between animal species, climate change, and people. With the support of the Undergraduate Research Opportunity Center and the Correct Scholars Program, I've partnered with Regeneración for this research project. Next slide, please. In this presentation, I will explain the method of how I formulated my research question, as well as discuss important findings. So what is my question of interest? I want to see how climate change and global sustainability affect women's beliefs, feelings, and concerns about their participation in raising children. I am almost 20 years old, and I've been thinking about having children in the near future. I developed this curiosity around what women think in regards to this, and I was actually really surprised to find that there is a lack of coverage on the challenges that women face when thinking of starting a family. So I collected my data using Google Forms as an online survey. The survey was distributed through different networks and mediums, and the responses were collected over the span of 2.5 weeks. The survey was provided in both English and Spanish in order to reach a wider range of participants. There were 32 questions in total, and those who responded to the survey were 50 women from different backgrounds. These women were given the opportunity to share their experience and their perspective on having children either by birth, adoption, foster care, partnership, or by remaining childless by choice or through natural circumstances. Although respondents from the Pajaro Valley were encouraged to participate, people from all other areas participated in it as well. 26% of these were from the Pajaro Valley. You can also see that we also collected other demographics such as the races and ethnicities of each respondent, as well as their age ranges. Although I collected 5 age ranges in the survey, I decided to group them into 2 instead: childbearing years versus end of to post-childbearing years. You'll be able to see this in the charts coming up, and this was done to see if there were any noticeable differences.
Hi, Monica. This is Natalie. A couple notes to slow down for our interpreters, but you're doing great. Thank you.
Okay, no problem. Thank you. Next slide, please. So what are women saying about this? In the survey, when respondents were asked about their current thoughts on giving birth to a child, these 2 quotes really embodied the uprising concerns of younger generations and were overall reflective of my results. The first quote reads, "I'm not ready to have children yet. This world is hard to live in, politically, financially, and environmentally." An important thing to mention is that this quote written in English was from someone within the 18 to 24 age group. The second quote in Spanish comes from someone within the 45 plus age group. The English translation will be in the chat for those who want to follow along. But she states, "Es una responsabilidad muy grande y las condiciones sociales, económicas y climáticas no son las más favorables." Despite the difference in age, it's interesting to see how similar views can arise from similar concerns. These 2 statements really encompass the central message of this project and will help establish the focus of this presentation. Sometimes we have to take into consideration how our races and ethnicities play a role in what we believe in and value most. When I was analyzing the results of my survey, I noticed that certain individuals in each race and ethnicity group expressed different concerns when thinking about forming families. For example, one of the individuals who identifies as white, Caucasian, or European expressed a concern for overpopulation. On the contrary, one of the individuals from Asian descent hopes that in the future there will be a cure for pain, suffering, and violence. The last example is from a respondent of Mexican origin who declared her opposition to the contamination of our oceans, rivers, lakes, and terrestrial ecosystems. Hopefully, these next examples will help you better visualize what's happening in this chart. Notice that there are some values on a scale of 1 to 7. Respondents were asked on the survey to rate their concerns. A value of 1 represents not at all concerned, and 7 represents very significant. The rest of the charts will be organized the same way by levels of concern on a scale of 0 to 7. Here we can see that for each race and ethnicity group, the concern for climate change appears to be the highest amongst other environmental related issues. So, as you can see, this data is looking at all respondents within the 18 to 35 age range. Let's take a look at the next chart. So you may be wondering why this chart looks different if the concerns are the same. Well, the height of each bar looks different because we are now analyzing the data for individuals in the 36 to 45 plus age range. The top concerns across all categories were climate change, pollution, and pesticides. This is true for both age groups. Although there is a similar variability between each of these concerns for each of the race and ethnicity groups, the 18 to 35 group, however, was more concerned overall. Next slide, please. It's quite evident that climate change is the leading concern across all participants. Let's take a look at the first quote here about the consequence of sea level rise. If many cities do become uninhabitable, as she states, the people in these affected areas would realistically have to relocate. This circumstance could eventually lead to an economic crisis and affect people's concerns for financial stability. Considering that this could be plausible, it would be interesting to see if the levels of concern for societal issues, such as racial injustice, economic crisis, financial security, and access to medical care, are parallel to the data we just looked at for environmental and health-related issues. The second quote comes from an individual within the 24 to 29 years of age. She expresses her concern for the future and how unfit it may be to care for a child. She specifically addresses climate change, which further emphasizes that this is a prominent concern to consider when deciding to raise a child. Now let's take a look at a different set of variables. In this chart, it may look very similar to the previous ones, but the only change is that we are now observing data for social and economic concerns. The central idea is still the same. In other words, we are continuing to observe these concerns with the thought of starting a family in mind. The responses used in this chart were gathered from individuals within the 18 to 35 age group. So what can we gather from this data? Well, we can see that for each of the social and economic variables, all individuals in this data set rated their concerns a 5 out of 7 or higher. This tells us that these women are highly concerned on average about social and economic issues. Let's take a look at the next chart to see if there are any differences that we can spot. Now we are looking at the results from the 36 to 45 plus age group. See if you can identify the top concerns. One thing to note before making assumptions about the data is that there was only one respondent for the Asian race and ethnicity group and the 2 or more race ethnicity group. So while it appears that they have higher concerns overall, we just have to account for the fact that these ratings come from one person. Right away, I can see that there is a decrease in some of these ratings. Those who identified as Mexican, Mexican American, or Hispanic, Latino, and Chicana rated lower for all social and economic concerns than those from the younger age group. Next slide, please. We saw in the last 2 charts that the 18 to 35 age group were generally more concerned. One of the top concerns people had was having access to medical care. The quote below states, "I worry about the control the government will exert on the medical choices of our citizens. I worry about pollution and toxic chemicals overloading my baby's system." This person is a mother who worries for the well-being of her child, both environmentally and socially. If mothers are constantly thinking about the harmful effects of chemicals and pollutants, it would make sense that they'd give a high rating for access to medical care. Okay, so these next 2 charts will be comparing something a bit different. They aim to summarize the correlation between the number of desired children and levels of concern for ages 18 to 35 only. We chose to focus on this age range due to the likelihood of female fertility decreasing after the age of 35. As you can see, this first graph is looking at environmental and health concerns. Respondents were asked for the number of children they were planning to have within the next 5 to 10 years. The options were 1 child, 2 children, and 3 or more children. the most apparent judgment we can make is that people who plan to have 0 to 1 children tend to have the highest amounts of concerns. Now let's look at the next one. On this slide, observe the correlation between the number of desired children and levels of social and economic concerns. Respondents were asked the same question and were given the same 3 options. Those who said that within the next 5 to 10 years, they plan to have 0 to 1 children had higher concerns across all categories for environmental, health, social, and economic concerns. Those who said they are planning to have 2 children had high concerns, but those who chose 3 or more children on average had lower concerns for all categories. So what does this tell us? The first 2 quotes on this slide, if you recall, are the same that were introduced to you at the beginning of this presentation. The only difference here is that I added the number of intended children they plan to have along with their age. So you could start to picture how the concerns relate to age and the number of children. Let's take a look at the last quote. The respondent selected 3 or more children. When looking at her data, she rated climate change, racial injustice, pesticides, overpopulation, and food security a 1 out of 7, which is synonymous for not at all concerned. However, she was somewhat concerned with economic crisis, financial security, and access to medical care, which is reflective of the hopes and fears that she mentioned in her response. So what can we say overall about the data to sum up this presentation? I know it was a lot, but the trend that I saw within the data revealed that the lower number of desired children, in other words, if they chose 0 to 1 child, correlated with higher levels of concerns for both environmental and socially related issues. The following slide has some potential questions that can be used for future research if any of you are interested. And I'd be happy to share the survey with you if needed. We can communicate via email, just reach out to either me or my mentor. Both of our emails are on the slide. Thank you so much for your time and your undivided attention.
Thank you so much, Monica. That was very informative. And again, we will try and get this research posted to Regeneracion's website, as well as reaching out to Regeneracion, Tori, or Monica. Next, I'd like to introduce the visual storytelling project, Intergenerational Reflections, Women in the Pajaro Valley by Kriti Basendine.
Hi, my name is Kirti Fatanya Besendine. I'm a fine art photographer and a journalist. I was born in Kenya and immigrated to England, where I graduated with my fine art photography. I've always been interested in human relationships and how they interweave within social and cultural contexts. I've exhibited work on homeless voices, environmental justice, women, and immigrant rights. My experience as an immigrant living in 3 continents has provided insight into how minorities are perceived and how subcultures integrate or conflict with the modern society. I've been working on this project, intergenerational reflection, about the 3 generations of women in Pajaro Valley, through interviews, storyboards, and photography. These portraits are part of a larger storytelling project through photography of women and young girls, showcasing their stories of exchange in cultural knowledge, passing on wisdom and vision of equitable and sustainable future.
as Kirti mentioned, that was a preview to a larger storytelling project on how climate impacts affect women in the Bajada Valley. Next, I'd like to share a recorded video testimony by one of our interpreters, Angela. The video is spoken in Mixteco with Spanish on-screen subtitles. A transcript in both Spanish and English will be provided in the chat. However, I encourage you to take this opportunity to listen to the spoken Mixteco, which is one of the many indigenous languages native to Oaxaca, Mexico. Here is Angela on her and her family's experience working in agriculture.
Angela nani yu Oaxaca gima ñu campos xa ni chinina campos cachiño nani tashi yoña México. Si sin estado shi y yoña chi cosecha shin kuña. Tani no uña Baja California no cachiño ña no shi shanza ña pino shi tinana. Ika no xa ni i. Yuñuni ni ikita shi shan ishinani shi cachiño ña fil ña Baja California. Ika no contani reka kisha ikisha valora ira kisha respeta ichiño kisha ni. Tonto hueva cachiñe mi fil regara kwa awebi cha binaye. Tasabaran tu shako eni tita kunsa piba. Kwa kisha to kunsa pi kwa kisha to inin tu shako echiña ka forma chinse familia ni. Tash kachini irani tikuya 90 grado ba ikanto nive. Sabara kisha tishi nive i yashimika nire kasati tata hana shami planta ba mi pesticida kisha kwetiraka ba shi inta sabara kara kisha aguanta nye chikunta nye shiniñu chinse familia nye. Simba nya shiniñu kanse nya takachiñe filters kachini shimora rishkisho sandu kanasta ba bote ba to imbango ba. Tondo ba shishini inta tondo chantu shaga Washingtona sina shana nuchaga rikashina sina shinyuse tashkachinyu na mi campo. Campo ranya sashku yarnya saku vaya parte vida nya irana kwa awe itasha vishaka chita shavinsku tiempo kachini campo kuto pinza que comida nya irana shakisha shana kuntani tina chun importante weya na kwa eta shavira casa valorens kuchinyu kisha na jibi kachinyu campo.
Again, thank you so much to Angela. People experience the world through their native language. It's the way that they most easily express themselves and share their unique stories. And it's a key factor in how we can achieve equal and inclusive relationships with each other. So now I'm super excited to introduce our climate resilience panel moderated by Ashley Gower. So Ashley, can I invite you on screen?
Hi, Natalie. Great. We ready? Okay, well, thank you, Natalie, and everyone at Regeneración for inviting me and our powerhouse panelists to partake in Regeneración's third climate forum today. It's been super grounding and super educational so far. Mahalo, thank you to all our prior presenters. A few reminders for our audience as we segue into this next part of our program. We'll ask you to make a few audio interpretation switches from English to Spanish and vice versa throughout the discussion. Also, feel free to log your questions using the Q&A box during the panel discussion, which we'll try to answer all during Q&A, and if not, we'll answer them through an email post-forum. So to start, I'm happy to represent the Monterey Bay Economic Partnership, to which we'll include a link in the chat box for folks to learn more about our initiatives in housing, broadband infrastructure, workforce development, and climate change, and how we collaborate with our members and partners on intersectoral regional solutions where equity, environmental stewardship, and economic vitality lie at the forefront. You can also learn more about upcoming events such as our Housing Element Kickoff on March 12th, the Central Coast Climate Action Summit on March 31st, and our annual Economic Summit on May 6th. Please join us and make your voice heard. Speaking of the economy, and to complement Monica's study, in the US alone, as most of you may or may not know, roughly 2.5 million women have left the workforce since the onset of the pandemic, with Black, Hispanic, and single moms amongst the hardest hit. And as Vice President Kamala Harris poignantly stated, the quote, the mass exodus of women from the working world is a national emergency that requires a national solution, end quote. I can't express how timely it is for Regeneración and CSUMB to come together to focus on how the climate emergency, of which the pandemic is part, disproportionately impacts girls and women. The central roles that they play. More importantly, how women are stepping up in their gender and climate activism, and how our panelists today are working towards social and environmental justice while building climate resilient communities. So without further ado, I'm honored to have this opportunity to introduce you all to our incredibly diverse, multicultural, multi-generational panel, all of whom embody and embrace their multifaceted roles as women and leaders in their families, in their communities, and field of work. We have Nayeli Gallardo, a sustainable energy specialist, Natasha Burr, a landscape designer, Mireya Gomez Contreras, co-leader at Esperanza Community Farms, and Hermilena Vasquez, project member of Esperanza Community Farms as well. Welcome, ladies. Let's go ahead and dive into it and begin by having each of you share a little bit about your story. So Nayeli and Natasha, if you could join us now as young professionals in your field, tell us a little bit about how you got to where you are today and how you and or others you know have been affected by climate impacts, genderism, ageism, and other forms of injustice. Nayeli, let's start with you.
Yeah, thank you, Ashley, and thank you to Regeneración for this. So a bit about me. I was born in Jalisco in Mexico, and I grew up mostly in Greenfield in the Salinas Valley of California. My family and I immigrated to the US following sort of an American dream, and my parents knew that education was the way to pursue this dream and to achieve it. So they always supported our education, and we are super blessed to have been also in a community that supported us as we pursued that dream. So through our school, our church, and organizations like Girls Inc., we got a lot of support from the community. So eventually I ended up at Stanford, and I had to choose a major, of course, to study. I was very drawn to the natural world and how it works and how helpful it can be to apply what we know from the natural world to solving people's problems. So I ended up majoring in civil engineering. And after all, engineering and technology is basically about applying what we know from math and from science into solving some problem. So that really drew me to this. And within civil engineering, I was really interested in water and environment. So fast forward a bit, and I was working in the energy sector in Mexico City, where I realized that I had this passion for sustainable energy. And after a few years, I decided to specialize in this, and I moved to Europe to study a master's in sustainable energy systems with EIT InnoEnergy. I've recently returned to the US, hoping to apply this to the domestic energy challenges. And I'm joining in from Chicago, which has for centuries been a meeting place of Native peoples. I live here with my husband, and I'm happy to be joining here. I think I'd just like to highlight from my experience the role that my mentors and my role models and my peers have played in my choosing a STEM field and staying in it, because engineering was something absolutely foreign to me growing up and to my family. And being a minority in energy, I think it's very easy to get to fall into self-doubt. So for me, it's been very important to have supportive mentors and peers as I navigate all of this. So now I'm happy to be in the sector, and I see my role as a woman here, not only as a professional in the energy sector, but also as a bridge to bring also more women and more girls into the sector. It's interesting, but historically, women have been energy managers in their own households, and that's still the case in many parts of the world. So women have been in charge of gathering the food and the wood and other water, etc., to make sure that everything's okay at home. And today, still 3 billion people rely heavily on heavily polluting fuels to cook and to keep their house warm, etc. And because of this, still 3 million people die each year from the air pollution inside their home. So without even counting what's going on outside. That's more than COVID, and it's really important because it's mostly women and children who are breathing in this polluted air. So there's a lot to women and energy than we usually recognize, but still only 32% of women, or only 32% of jobs in renewable energy are held by women, and that's only 22% in energy overall, not renewable. So I think that this is a big problem because energy is very important. We use it to get from point A to point B, to keep our homes cool or warm, to work equipment that can be life-changing in hospitals. So we really can't stay out of this. We need women and girls on the table to figure out how to make energy truly sustainable, truly reliable, and truly affordable. So that's what I'd like to leave you all with. And now let's go to Natasha Burr, who is a landscape designer joining us from the San Francisco Bay Area.
Hi, everyone. And then just another reminder to speak slowly. I know we have a lot to cover, but for our interpreters, thank you so much.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for that, Natalie. I'm Natasha Burr. I was raised by my multi-ethnic immigrant parents in the state of Georgia. They are passionate artists that impressed upon me the importance of maintaining my cultural roots. I'm from the Kumhar caste and we are potters. So I found pottery to be a gateway that connected me with art and nature, which then led me to finding the field of landscape architecture, which combines design and ecology to analyze and plan how humans interact with nature and the built environment. Large urban parks like Golden Gate Park and civic spaces like town squares are designed by us. I got my start in the field by working for a nonprofit called Park Pride that designed, fundraised, and advocated for parks and green spaces in underserved communities in Atlanta. We maintained a strong connection with the community to better understand what they needed, and we worked with the city to get those things done. I now work for a firm called Vita as a designer, and I've worked on coastal restoration projects concerned with erosion control, lack of biodiversity, and sea level rise. I've also worked on an industrial brownfield restoration project like Mill District, as you can see, in Healdsburg, California, that incorporates green infrastructure improvements, extensive workforce housing, and community gardens. If we as planners are not considering the long-term impact of climate change, then we're not doing our jobs properly. This field has come a long way, and we have a strong understanding of what we need to do to honor cultural resources and combat climate change from an ecological perspective. But what we lack is human empathy. Cities are becoming more and more efficient, but women are not at the table to help inform the decision-making process. So certain needs are overlooked. In Sweden, the city of Stockholm went through a process called gender-balanced budgeting, which helped inform their decision to plow the snow of side streets and sidewalks before they plow the main streets. This is because while men would commute to and from work and needed the main streets to plowed, women often used side streets to run a number of errands or were more likely to walk with children in tow. Reversing the snow clearance order reduced the number of people admitted to the hospital for snow-related incidences, especially women, and it made their lives easier, while it had little to no impact on men who were not bothered by driving in a few inches of snow. I've often been the only woman in the room or the only person of color, but more often than not, both at the same time. Like many others, my field took a huge hit during the last recession, and not many people, especially women, returned to the industry. Now there's a huge gap in knowledge and leadership, and I've had a difficult time finding a woman to mentor me. Out of frustration in 2019, my coworker and I started an initiative called WAVES, which is Women at Vita Empowering Success, as a way to spread knowledge and share experiences. We're now part of a larger organization called WXLA, which is motivated to foster a supportive and inclusive community. We have some systemic issues that are not unique to my field, but they set us back from achieving the common goal of landscape architecture, which is to protect the public's health and safety and welfare. And it distracts us from our vital goal of mitigating climate change through policy planning and physical design. Thank you.
Thank you, Natasha and Nayeli, for sharing a snippet of your journey, your work, and some of the impacts you've witnessed along the way. We're going to take a quick 1 to 2 minute silent, no video pause for our interpreters to make the switch and for you to toggle from English to Spanish and Spanish to English before we introduce our next 2 panelists.
We're ready when you are, Ashley.
Okay, great. Wonderful. Thank you, everyone, for your patience and deep, deep appreciation to our interpreters. Mireya and Ermelinda, as mothers and seasoned practitioners in community sustainable agriculture, tell us a little bit about yourselves, your work, and how you and or others have been affected by climate impacts and different forms of oppression and injustice.
Muy buenas tardes a cada uno de ustedes. Nos da mucho gusto estar aquí. Gracias por la invitación. Yo me llamo Mireya y mis valores universales son la valentía, la dignidad y la interconexión para mí y para todos. Tengo el placer de trabajar para una organización sin fines de lucro que se llama Esperanza Granja Comunitaria, o en inglés es Esperanza Community Farms. Esta granja está aquí en el Valle del Pájaro, en Watsonville, y pues ya llevamos 3 años desde que formó la organización. Yo, a nivel personal, soy originaria, bueno, me considero originaria de México porque ya crecí desde chiquita, desde meses a los 6 años, pero técnicamente nací aquí en este país. Cuando mis papás me trajeron al país, yo tenía casi 7 años y me acuerdo, mis papás eran campesinos, trabajaban piscando uva, espárragos, cherry, calabaza, de todas cosas. y yo pues desde chiquita corría detrás de ellos mientras piscaban la verdura. Me acuerdo que mi mamá muchas veces se la pasaba cantando y parecía muy alegre porque pues al final a ella le gustaba mucho el estar al aire libre y trabajar con la tierra. Soy mamá de 2 hijos y tengo más de 25 años viviendo en el Valle de Pájaro y estoy agradecida con el equipo que tenemos en la granja. Voy a hablar más acerca de eso en un momento. Disfruten las imágenes que estamos compartiendo con ustedes. Y le paso el micrófono a mi compañera Hermelinda.
Hola, buenas tardes. Estoy muy contenta y gracias por invitarme a este panel. Le voy a hablar acerca de mí. Yo soy Hermelinda Vázquez Matías, soy originaria de Oaxaca, México. Una de las razones por que emigré a este país son para tener una mejor vida. Tengo viviendo en California 15 años. Cuando llegué a este país, yo he trabajado de todo, lavaplatos, limpiando casas, cuidando niños, de todo he trabajado. También trabajo el arte que yo aprendí en mi estado, que son los alebrijes, nos identifica Oaxaca. Y también el bordado hecho a mano, las blusas, yo lo aprendí de niña. Una de las razones que he decidido estar en esta granja, la Esperanza Community Farm, es porque me he identificado con las familias, los niños. Hemos aprendido y a valorar lo que la tierra nos ha ofrecido, los vegetales orgánicos. Me siento bendecida y con toda la familia las familias que hemos compartido estas actividades, porque se dan cuenta los niños especialmente de cómo nacen, sembramos y cosechamos, cultivamos todas las plantas orgánicas. Y todo esto tengo enseñanzas de mi padre que yo crecí de niña en el campo aprendiendo a sembrar, a cosechar y a comer los vegetales. Entonces es una gran oportunidad esta que yo tengo para trabajar para esta comunidad. Y gracias.
Muy bien, gracias Hermelinda y Medea. Y qué hermosa su granja anclado en comunidad. Let's switch and return back to your original audio channels for the next 2 questions and responses. I just want to say too that it's so nice to get a peek into all of your lives as you all represent so many different aspects of what it means to be a woman in your field of work. So let's move into your expressions on climate solutions and how we can collectively foster and cultivate women's leadership in all sectors of society. We'll start with you, Natasha. I just love that you and your colleague decided to create a mentorship program for girls in your community. So the first question is to help foster more equitable opportunities for women, what kind of support do you think women need to be able to not just overcome barriers, but thrive in the workforce and contribute to creating a more fair and inclusive climate solutions?
Thank you, Ashley, and thank you for moderating this. What we need are women's voices in order to find more creative solutions to the problems we face, especially the construction industry. It is a very male-dominated world. There are a lot of barriers to entry for women, including a lack of access to childcare, pay inequity, and discrimination. Some solutions we are working on include continuing education for licensure with an emphasis on designing for climate change, developing stronger mentorship programs, as we mentioned, and reaching out to schools, as not a lot of people even know that this field exists. Other ways that people can get involved is to speak up around your community, join initiatives or advocacy groups like Regeneration, or start your own organization. So, thank you.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks for that, Natasha. Well, I couldn't agree more. While there's still a lot to be done, each of us can do our part by creating forums like this, right, to engage in more dialogue and strengthen our talent pipelines and educational offerings, joining or starting similar mentorship or peer group initiatives like you did. And Nayeli, given that you're a graduate of the National Mentorship Program Girls Inc. and now a leader in sustainable energy, can you give us some examples of clean energy solutions and how women in particular can provide a unique perspective in developing and implementing them?
Yeah, definitely. That's a great question. I think first of all, it's important to note that there isn't one technology or policy that's going to fix it all. But as Natasha said, we need everybody at the table so that we can get more ideas. To mention just a couple, in terms of the huge portion of the population that does not have access to modern energy, as I mentioned earlier, there are technologies like efficient cook stoves that use less wood, or also biodigesters to get cooking gas from agricultural waste. And these technologies are already being adopted by women all over the world. And I think that as more women adopt them, they will build on them and they will improve them and they will adapt them to their own needs. I actually once met a woman whose house burned down. This was a woman who lived in a village in Peru. Her house burned down after a cooking accident on a sort of old-fashioned open stove. And when she rebuilt her home, she rebuilt it with a more efficient stove. And she became an advocate in her community for other women to do the same. And I think that's a really inspiring story. Another thing I can mention is community solar, which we are all familiar with solar energy, of course, but not everybody can have solar on their roofs, for example, and not everybody's electric utility actually gets their energy from solar. So community solar is an innovative application of an existing technology because it allows people who, because of some reason, they don't have the ability to put roofs on their pan roofs, maybe because they're renters or they live in a multifamily building. It allows them to participate in a solar farm somewhere in their state, ideally as local as possible. And in that way, they support clean energy and they actually save money as well. A third and last example I'll mention is regarding energy storage. We all know that wind and solar energy are clean and they're great, but unfortunately, we can't turn them on whenever we need energy. So ideally, we would be able to just store it and use it when we need it, which we do to an extent, but the batteries that we've had so far, the conventional ones, are just not very good at that, or not very good for that application. There's actually a woman named Maria Squilas Casacas who invented an alternative technology, and it's one of the most promising ones now for this application of renewable energy. And it's interesting because she has said that she was afraid of math and science when she was little, but she was encouraged by a math teacher. And I think this just is one example of how clear it is that women really bring something to the table, bring a lot of things to the table. And there are now more and more studies that also show this with numbers, but I think also individual stories are really important too.
Yeah, definitely. Wonderful, Nayeli, thank you. And also, if our audience wants to learn more about these solutions, please feel free to direct message any one of our panelists during the discussion. And lastly, also, I just want to say too, there's a lot going on right here in our region that Nayeli touched on a little bit, and I'd be happy to connect you if you want to learn more about that as well. Lastly, Mireya and Ermelinda, given your wealth of knowledge and experience from individual to cultural to collective aspects of systems and institutional change, what's your call to action? This will be our last question for the panel, but what's your call to action to our audience? And are there any resources or ways to get involved that you'd like to share as it relates to supporting and developing women leaders to advance a more climate resilient future?
Sí, gracias por la pregunta. Me quiero asegurar que las personas cambiaron de canal para que nos puedan entender.
Yes.
Bueno,
That reminder.
esa es una buena pregunta, Ashley. Esa pregunta que se hace muchas veces. ¿Cuál es el llamado a la acción, verdad? Y es una buena pregunta, pero estaba yo pensando, no hay una sola solución, ¿verdad? Para abordar este tema y interrumpir el cambio climático.
Sí.
La verdad es que para nosotros nos ha funcionado mucho pensar en términos de un marco que se llama los 4 niveles de opresión y cambio. Quiere decir que estos 4 niveles, el nivel personal, interpersonal, institucional y cultural, debemos de activar estrategias en los 4 niveles a la misma vez, de una manera coordinada para poder ver un cambio sostenible a largo plazo. Entonces, en nuestra granja, por ejemplo, lo hacemos muy intencionalmente y el hecho de estar aquí con mi compañera, por ejemplo, que es miembro de la granja, el hecho de estar hablando en nuestro idioma natal, por ejemplo, el hecho de que tengamos un equipo, o sea, nuestro equipo, al que se le paga, todos somos personas mexicanas, indígenas o chicanas. Y eso tiene mucho que ver con la urgencia de interrumpir sistemas racistas y poder presentar un modelo alternativo a los sistemas que nos oprimen a todos y todas, en todo lugar. Mi llamada a la acción sería, hay que ser todos intencionales con las actividades y las decisiones que tomamos en cuanto a nuestro interés de interrumpir el cambio climático. Y hay que hacerlo con audacia, se dice. Hay que hacerlo, aunque se sienta que puede ser un riesgo, hay que hacerlo con la seguridad y la esperanza de que va a haber un cambio y que ese cambio nos va a beneficiar a todos. A las mujeres, no lo dije anteriormente, somos marginalizadas por ser mujer y por ser, en este caso, mujeres no blancas, no nos identificamos como blancas. Entonces, desde ese punto de vista hay mucho que se puede hacer. Hay que escoger qué nivel nos toca y hacerlo con intención. Le paso la palabra a mi compañera.
Gracias otra vez. Yo quiero compartir algo porque dice que hay que dejar un consejo y compartir con la audiencia. Entonces, yo quiero compartir, por ejemplo, cuando vamos a comprar la comida, tenemos que como analizar, decidir y dónde lo vamos a comprar. Entonces, nosotros como estamos trabajando en la granja, vemos que la comida, los vegetales son orgánicos. Entonces, cuando vamos, ¿dónde queremos ir a comprar? A veces nos vamos a comprar como en las tiendas, pero en las tiendas sí nos damos cuenta que ahí está más económico y a lo mejor podemos agarrar un poco más, pero no estamos viendo la calidad del producto. Y decidimos para ahorrar también el dinero y ahorrar el vegetal que vamos a comprar, porque a veces compramos mucho, pero lo que nos vamos a comer es muy poco. Entonces, eso, yo quiero compartir con eso que cómo vamos a planear, a comprar nuestra comida. Tenemos que analizar, planear y dónde lo vamos a hacer. Entonces, esto es lo que quiero compartir con ustedes.
Gracias. Nuestro sueño es que cada familia en el Valle de Pájaro esté conectado con una granja. Imagínense como lo hacemos con un doctor, con una escuela, con un psicólogo, con un parque. Así debería ser. Hay que localizar nuestros recursos. Esa es una raíz muy importante para el cambio social.
Y otra cosa que estamos apoyando. Estamos apoyando.
Vamos a empezarlo.
Sí, a lo local.
Ya, ya.
Eso es lo
Muy
más
bien, gracias a los dos. Sí, estoy de acuerdo con sus respuestas y vamos, let's go ahead and switch channels for a second once again. I absolutely love that call to action clause. I mean, as a former instructor of gardening and nutrition in schools, I know for a fact it makes a world of a difference for young children and families and businesses to know where their food comes from and understand what it takes to grow, like you said, to relearn the value of labor. It's powerful. So we are approaching time. We could talk for hours, for days on this. I'm sure we have some questions queuing up now in our Q&A. And I think we have time for about 1 or 2 questions. So let's go ahead and move into that box. Okay. So the first question we have here. Okay, what might solutions to our climate crises look like if viewed from the perspective of a brown or Black girl who is also poor? Thank you for asking that. If any of our panelists want to take a stab at that. It's a big question.
I can answer and I'll do it in English. I'll be brief so that my compañeros can answer. It's a good question. I think part of the answer has to do with relationships and experiences. For the asker, I'd say ask a young brown girl directly, build a relationship with that brown girl. And you'll, because the answer that she's going to give is her answer. And it's a partial answer because there are many young girls. And but it's through relationships, as far as I'm concerned, over time, that we can truly begin to understand at a really physiological level what that answer even means, in terms of how we can turn that into action.
Mm-hmm.
I can write an answer in the chat. I can tell you what I might have said when I was 10, but I think getting out of our head is an important part of how to inform ourselves towards this idea of taking action for social change and climate change.
Thank you, Maria. Nayeli or Natasha, would you like to add to that?
I think that was an excellent response. The only thing I would also perhaps add to that is, from that perspective, you have to see it in terms of short-term needs rather than long-term goals. Climate change is, we are seeing the impact of it today in terms of forest fires and pollution and sea level rise and storm surge, but how that impacts someone on a day-to-day basis is just that financial security and stability, and not knowing if there's going to be food on the table, if there's going to be work tomorrow, if there are going to be those answers. So that I think while we are tackling the bigger issues of climate change, we also have to tackle the societal impact of that and what that means to young women and young girls.
Mm-hmm.
I agree with everything that's been said. I'll just briefly add that I think it's really important for everyone, or for usually a poor brown or Black girl would not have a say in this, but that doesn't need to be the case, because no one is going to understand the problems that this girl faces, then no one is going to understand them more than she does. So I would say look at what you are, look at what you're facing, what challenges you're facing in relation to climate, and look at what resources you have. That may be wisdom from your mom, that may be something in your school, that may be some research you do online, some course, it could be formal, informal relationships, and anything, but find out what resources you have, and then try things out. A lot of great ideas happen that way, just identifying a problem, trying to fix it, and you never know, sometimes really great things happen, and before you know it, other people are also adding to your idea. So just I would say the first step is to do something about it, to identify and empower yourself, identify your problem and empower yourself to do something about it.
Yes, that's great. And I would add to all of that, please reach out to us after this conference. If there's no one that you feel comfortable reaching out to in your community, I'm sure there are. It might take a little bit of research in the beginning, but there could be other individuals on your campus, within your community, within your neighborhood, or in your family. And if you're not finding organizations that you relate to, please reach out to us and we will help connect you. That being said, unfortunately, we do not have time to answer the rest of the questions in the Q&A box right now. However, like I mentioned at the beginning, we will take them and answer them in an email format and send them to you after the forum. So thank you again for your participation, and for everyone that's been commenting in the chat box as well. Thank you for your comments and your advice and your suggestions and your questions. I wish we could have all of our panelists, continue to speak on all these issues, but like I mentioned, we'll be in touch after the forum. Thank you, panelists, for sharing your ancestral wisdom and for being your authentic selves with us today, for your diligence and your grace in the fight for justice. Like you all alluded to, there's no silver bullet. It'll require all of us to close the gap and to nurture women's leadership so that we can all expedite equitable climate solutions. So again, please reach out to us, send us a direct message, or be in contact with the organizers at Regeneración to get in touch with us. Thank you all for your time and attention. I'll turn it back over to Natalie. Mahalo, ladies. Hope to see you soon.
Thank you so much. My deepest appreciation to our panelists and our panel moderator. So now we will be taking another 1-minute language break. And in that break, we have some special slides, art show slides to show you as well. All right, thank you all so much again, especially to our panelists. I wanted to share that oftentimes in the climate space, we talk about these solutions to climate issues, and we're often told that they seem impossible. But it's here in these spaces where we can start to speak these solutions into existence that we can really begin to reimagine what our sustainable and just world will look like, and how we can begin to put these practices into place. So now I'm so happy to introduce our final keynote speaker here to speak on equitable transportation, Leslie Aguayo, the Environmental Equity Program Manager at the Green Lining Institute. She is an urban planner and advocate with experience in poverty alleviation, asset building, affordable housing, equitable transportation, and community outreach strategies. So welcome, Leslie. Can I invite you on camera?
Hi, yes, thank you, Natalie, and thank you all for having me here. I'm Leslie Aguayo. I'm an Environmental Equity Program Manager with the Green Lining Institute located in Oakland, California. And today I prepared some slides, so let me go ahead and share my screen, and we'll go ahead and get started. Okay, so can I just get a thumbs up from someone that my screen is showing and that there are some slides on your screen?
We can see your slides, Leslie.
Perfect. Thank you. Great. So yes, like I was saying, I'm Leslie Aguayo. I work for the Green Lining Institute in Oakland, and I'm excited to share with you all the topic of why racial and gender equity matters in transportation. So for 28 years, the Green Lining Institute has set out to bring economic opportunities to low-income communities of color through research, policy, advocacy, and leadership development. And I hope that this presentation will inspire more conversations about this important intersection. Let me move the slides. Oh. There we go. So first, I'd like to start with how green lining defines equity. So we hold that equity is transforming the behaviors, institutions, and systems that disproportionately harm people of color. Equity means increasing access to power, redistributing and providing additional resources, and eliminating barriers to opportunity in order to empower low-income communities of color to thrive and reach their full potential. And to be clear, equity is not the same thing as equality. As you can see through this image, equality is the assumption that the playing field is level. Equity, however, acknowledges that people are starting from very different places because of systemic injustices. An example of this is redlining. And so we at Green Lining are called green lining because we think it's an antidote to redlining. And I'll go ahead and explain a little bit more about what that is. So in order to share why race and gender matters in transportation policy and why we must lead with equity, I'm going to tell 3 stories today. First, I'm going to tell the story of the past and recount the history of race in America and how it relates to our built environment and economy. Then I'll tell the story of today and how the past manifests in pain and injustice for women and people of color. And finally, I'll tell you the story of tomorrow and how we can work together to create a society that is just, healthy, and where all people can thrive. So let's start with the story of the past. In the 1930s, in the middle of the Great Depression, many families were struggling to make ends meet and were defaulting on their mortgages. In response, federal housing agencies began issuing government-backed mortgages to help post-war families build wealth through the Depression. However, not all families received help. Many historians credit this policy to helping families rebuild their lives during the crisis. But there is also a shameful side of this story that's not often talked about. It's one that's rooted in racism and one that our government and the real estate industry is directly responsible for. And it's called redlining. So to figure out how to distribute mortgages, governments worked with bankers and realtors to create maps to identify which neighborhoods to invest in based on risk. They created a grading system based on several factors like the quality of housing and others, but the primary indicator of risk was race. The neighborhoods were graded based on color codes that you can see here from these 4 maps. Green meant best, blue, still desirable, yellow, definitely declining, and red, hazardous. Areas that were redlined were seen as credit risks because of the presence of people of color. And this is where the term redlining comes from. And I want to share a quick fact that is very astonishing. Between 1932 and 1962, the federal government backed $120 billion of loans. More than 98% of that went to white families. This lack of investment in communities of color has led to extreme wealth inequality that we can still see along race lines today. And while redlining was technically outlawed decades ago, this lack of investment has had lingering impacts, particularly on our transportation system as well. And so another part of this story is the story of highways and the systematic redesign of our cities for the automobile. Highways were constructed often directly through communities of color. This destroyed local neighborhood economies and locked in air pollution and detrimental health impacts for decades to come. This neglect and disinvestment of the inner cities across the US only further disenfranchised communities of color. Redlining and highways were both born from America's long legacy of racist public policies, and today, subversive versions of redlining continue to take a toll on minorities such as women and people of color. And so now I'm going to transition into telling the story of today and how both women and people of color are still struggling with the legacy of racist policies, but also how we've begun to address them. Today, the current COVID-19 pandemic is pulling the curtains on America's deeply rooted inequities. People of color are the most impacted, with Latinx communities seeing some of the highest numbers of COVID cases, and African Americans making up the highest mortality rates. The economic impact associated with COVID is similarly impacting Black and Brown communities most severely. So when I saw this map of COVID-19 cases in San Francisco, I couldn't help but notice the striking similarities with the other 2 maps on the right, representing previously redlined communities and recent poverty and pollution burdens in the same locations. I also want to stress that both COVID-19 and racism are global pandemics with very real public health consequences. So it's not a surprise that COVID cases are disproportionately concentrated in the Latinx and Black community. In this graph, you see that Latinx and Black communities contain a higher percentage of cases compared to their share of the population. This data is from Alameda County, which encompasses a handful of cities in the East Bay, but it is representative of the US overall. If you notice, white people in Alameda County account for more than 40% of the population, but only make up 15% of COVID cases, whereas Latinx people account for 25% of COVID cases, but make up less than 25% of the population. Studies have also shown that women make up a majority of essential workers, unpaid caregivers, and domestic laborers, indicating that they are harder hit by COVID-19 than their male counterparts. In general, Black, Latinx, and Native communities have higher rates of pre-existing conditions and lead to greater risks of contracting COVID. At the same time, Asian American communities are experiencing increasing rates of xenophobia. And when you add that on top of the compounding risks that women carry, we can determine that women of color are bearing the brunt of this pandemic. If we keep in mind that women of color are more likely to live in poverty and depend on public transportation or older polluting vehicles to continue to make up the essential workforce, transportation isn't just a mode of physical mobility. It is most importantly a mode of upward economic mobility. So now let's talk about our last story. As we are making decisions about what kind of story we want to create for ourselves tomorrow, we have to keep in mind the stories of the past and present. The story of tomorrow is one where we don't just treat the symptoms of a broken system, but instead address systemic injustices and disparities, and in doing so, respond to real problems like climate change and economic inequality. I'm sure many of you have seen the consequences of climate change ravaging our country. I, for one, am currently located in Northern California, in the front row of some of last year's California forest fires, and can tell you firsthand how difficult those few weeks were, with many people experiencing not only the loss of life, the loss of their homes and safety, but also climate grief, a very real psychological response through anxiety and depression due to the impacts of climate destruction. So we can talk about mitigating climate change, but regardless of how much we lessen our greenhouse gas emissions, especially from transportation, the climate is still going to change and will continue to impact some communities more than others. The reason we have inequities in climate impacts is because of racist policies like redlining. Communities of color, specifically Black and Brown neighborhoods, have been and continue to be isolated into undesirable geographic areas that are more susceptible to climate change impacts. Not only are they more geographically vulnerable, they often lack reliable transportation options in the event of an emergency. And because of a lack of intergenerational wealth, these frontline communities will have a much more difficult time rebuilding their lives after natural disasters. So what can we do about this? Times are changing, cities are raising the bar on equity, and business as usual is not going to cut it anymore. We have new standards for how mobility services must benefit communities. As a result, some mobility companies are following suit, and now we have equity programs within their services. Clearly, equity is becoming mainstream, which is a good thing for the most part, because as equity becomes mainstream, there is a risk that it can turn into an empty promise if there is no strategy to achieve that promise. The consequences of not delivering on equity commitments can be even more harmful to our communities and to confidence in government. We have to get this right, because equity is not a commitment, it's a practice. So at Greenlining, we've developed this 4-step process where we determine what are the necessary steps to be able to make equity real. And so with any mobility project, plan, or program, equity must be embedded in 1, the mission, vision, and values, 2, the process, 3, the implementation and outcomes, and 4, the measurement and analysis. So here are some questions that I think are helpful in guiding communities, organizations, and individuals on some things that they can ask themselves on how to achieve and make equity real. When it comes to addressing the very real disproportionate impacts of COVID-19, we have urged agencies to commit to a just response that embeds an ease of the immediate burdens on communities, that delivers prosperity and opportunity, that builds long-term resilience, and incorporates this making equity real framework as mentioned in these steps. So some say that the pursuit of equity slows us down in reaching the clean energy future that we desperately need, but it doesn't. And in fact, we won't reach our climate goals if equity is not baked in from the very beginning, considering people of color and women, as well as other kinds of intersectional identities. If we fail to put equity at the center of our sustainability policies, this will only create new problems and new injustices that we will then have to face down the road. Equity is not an obstacle to progress and innovation, it's the foundation. And I think we're getting to a point where more and more people are starting to see that. We will see the return on our investment in equity when all people, regardless of their race, income, ability, gender, age, or zip code, have access to what they need to thrive in a clean energy future. Just imagine how much this world would benefit from if everyone has healthy environments and the entire economy is prosperous. Poor communities of color and the women who sustain them continue to suffer most from the legacy of segregation and racially motivated policies that have led to horrible exposure to pollution and toxins in their neighborhoods. As we collectively navigate these unprecedented times that have brought racial inequities to a head, it's paramount that we center race and gender to advance environmental equity for the protection and investment of communities most burdened by these compounding COVID-19, climate change, racial injustice, and gender inequities. Equity can bind us together to make us stronger and more resilient. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Leslie. We are so grateful that you could shed light on the disproportionate and unjust impacts of climate change and the impacts of, sorry, that was my timer. Yeah, so the impacts of present and historical systemic racism, racial and environmental issues are inextricably intertwined, and that's not something that we've always acknowledged in the mainstream environmental narrative, and we really can't begin to implement any real climate solutions without acknowledging that. So thank you very much. Again, we are so happy to have you. And now I would like to introduce our final video created by the Watsonville Wetlands Watch Climate Corps Leadership Institute.
Watsonville Wetlands Watch is a nonprofit organization with a mission to preserve, restore, and foster appreciation of the wetlands of the Pájaro Valley. The Climate Corps Leadership Institute was created to empower local high school youth with the tools and skills to lead their community in climate action.
Our Pájaro Valley is a wonderful home with its essential wetland habitats, flowing rivers, rich soil, and location by the ocean. However, global and sustainable development and increasing emissions are changing our local climate and causing negative impacts on human health. We already have climate solutions available to us to lessen these effects. Now all we need is collective action. As young women, we call on everyone to do their part to take immediate action in the fight against climate change.
As a young woman from Watsonville, climate solutions are important to me because I worry about the effects a hotter climate will have on the field workers of our community, especially pregnant women.
I worry about the future and what kind of world my baby sister will grow up in. I want her to grow up in a world where she can still see all the animals that were around when I was growing up.
For me, climate solutions mean that I have a chance to live a life that I want to without having to worry about my health. I have asthma and I want to live on a planet with clean air and more trees.
It is important to follow the leadership of women, especially the leadership of Indigenous women, low-income women, and women of color. Listening to the diverse perspectives of marginalized women can help to highlight additional problems caused by the climate crisis that have been ignored and lead us to better solutions.
The person who had the theory that an increased level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere would change the average temperature was actually a woman. Her name was Eunice Newton-Foote.
We are already being affected by climate impacts, but we can still act to protect our planet, our health, and the lives of future generations. We can vote in the elections to support systematic changes and hold our representatives accountable. We can work with our communities to create regenerative systems that benefit both people and the planet. We can volunteer, engage with our community, and use our voices to demand better for our future.
Thank you so much to the Watsonville Wetlands Watch and the future leaders from the Climate Corps Institute. Now, to give our final closing, I'd like to introduce the Associate Director for Service Learning at Cal State University, Monterey Bay, Andrea Monroe. We are so honored to have you. Welcome. Oh, you're muted.
Oh, you can't read lips. Thank you. I'm Andrea Monroe, as Natalie mentioned. And first of all, let me just start by saying, wow, this was just so beautifully inclusive, especially in terms of language. As for me, I unfortunately have LDBCP. I don't know if you've heard of it, but it's language deficit from colonial privilege. That is, I only speak English as a result of the deficit of my good schooling that told me that I didn't need any language other than English and maybe Latin to get into another good school. So the linguistic inclusivity of this afternoon was just so beautiful, and just thank you for pulling all of this together. As Natalie said, my name is Andrea Monroe, and I'm here on behalf of the Service Learning Institute at CSUMB. The building you see behind me, in addition to where I live, is part of the Rumsian Ohlone territory, if I was listening carefully. But I'm also a first-generation college graduate, a daughter of sharecroppers, domestic workers, later to become supermarket and factory workers from Westfield, New Jersey, which is just south of Newark, or more accurately, I should say, the Muncie, Lenape, Raritan territory. As a poet Amanda Gorman said in her inauguration poem, The Hill We Climb, when the day comes, we ask ourselves, where can we find light in this never-ending shade? And after what I heard today, I think we found it. The light is here among everyone, every woman you heard from today, from the opening and early speakers, Canyon Sayers-Rudes and Monica Uriasis, the CSUMB student, to Hermelinda and Mireya from Esperanza Farms, and the powerful and locally relevant closing from Leslie Aguayo from Greenlining, as well as the video stories and just everyone in between. So this light comes like a sunrise for me from the emerging leaders that we've heard from today. And also based on what I heard, I feel like I'm flying on wings made of pure joy and honestly relief. As an older ancestor in training, I just feel a lot of relief that our future is solid, in solid and loving and thoughtful and creative hands. So I'm very uplifted and inspired, and hopefully you are too. In fact, I'd love to see how inspired are you, rated on a scale from 1 to 10. So 10 means you're really inspired. Just put that in the chat. But I believe we also have another poll, but yeah, I'm curious. Yeah, how inspired are you? 10, maybe you're a 12. Great, so there's lots of 10s, beautiful. So I think we've got another poll to close with, and that kind of allows us to build on, like, where will you take the inspiration that you have? So the poll that you have, this is the question: what actions will you take in the next 30 days? And check all that apply. All right, and so the results. Sounds like what people are most inspired to do is to share something that they learned with a family member or a colleague. And panelists and speakers, we can't vote, but I'm right there with you. I am on fire and thinking of all the people I'm going to email right after the conference. So thank you. And I think we have another poll. Okay, yeah, thank you. what has been helpful today? And again, check all that apply. And also if there's any comments that you want to add, and people are putting shout outs in the chat, great. But what was most helpful for today? And if you voted, go ahead and also add in the chat a specific idea for climate action that you will take in the next 30 days. Okay, in this case, a few people are only getting the one option. But again, learning from panelists and speakers, that was the most helpful thing that most of you report on for this afternoon's conference. Okay. Thank you. Thanks for that feedback. So in closing, we just want to say thank you to everyone whose work and service made this happen. First of all, I really want to thank every single planner, interpreter, the tech Zoom maestra, every speaker, and of course, the emerging leaders that we heard from. And I'm thinking specifically the CSUMB student researchers and young folks who are on the videos. All of those emerging leaders, thank you for all of your service and work. Heartfelt thanks to all of the sponsors of today's program. And let's be clear, when we thank sponsors, it's often like leaving the movie as the credit rolls, but institutional support for this work is really an institutional act of alliance building. It's an institutional act of advocacy for environmental stewardship. And it's an institutional act of advocating for the inclusion of all people, especially people who've been pushed aside to both join as well as co-lead the fight to save Mother Earth. So these sponsors are angels, are dear people, institutions, and maybe most importantly, advocates and allies. So I'd like to thank CSUMB, my institution, and as well as thanking Regeneration for doing this. We're a co-host of this event. Major sponsors, like to thank California Environmental Protection Agency Small Environmental Justice Grant Program and the Community Foundation for Monterey County, who their generous support really formed a lot of the backbone for making this happen. Collaborating partners, Pajaro Valley Arts and Watsonville Wetlands Watch, our climate change champion, Ecology Action, and our Earth Advocate, Central Coast Community Agency. And again, there's many other sponsors, farm worker friends such as Girls Inc. of Central Coast, Pajaro Valley Federation of Teachers, Monterey County Land Watch, and nonprofit partners Santa Cruz Climate Action Network, Environteers, Watsonville Wetlands Watch, and the Citizens Climate Lobby. So with that,
Andrea, can we invite everyone on screen also to give our final thank you, our whole behind the scenes team. There were so many people involved in this.
Great. Yes, thanks to you all. I mean, this was just such a powerful event. And based on the chat, it was beyond powerful for everyone who was here. And so with that, concludes today's program. We are going to have, there is a reception afterwards. And is there a Zoom link that's going to be in the chat?
Yes, the Zoom link is in the chat and on screen.
Great. So again, thank you all for coming.
Thank you, Andrea.